Yep, looks
Okay,
great.
that's a southern flounder, Paralictes lithostigma, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we've been using acoustic telemetry to understand their migration routes and patterns of habitat use inshore and offshore North Carolina. Just before I get going into my talk, I want to acknowledge the whole ECU team that has been doing this work. I'm only one small part of this. Rebecca Ash in the upper right left there is our team leader. She's an assistant professor in our Department of Biology and is the PI on the project. Caitlin McGarrigle holding the flounder in the center there is our technician. She's been doing some amazing good field work and did a lot of the slide preparations and analysis that I'm going to show you today. Mark Sprague next to her is an acoustical physicist who I've been working with for a long time, helps us with our acoustic modeling and wave glider deployments. Eric Diodorio is our captain there in the white slicker in front of the wave glider, along with Tyler Peacock, a PhD student in my lab. They do a lot of the field work as well. Pat Harris in the bottom left is a fisheries biologist in our department. Brian Bartlett is a PhD student in Rebecca's lab. I'm on his committee, but he's studying grouper of all things, but we got him to work on southern flounder. Roger Wolfson is now retired, but is still active on this project. And Justin Mitchell is a master's student. Rebecca and I are co-advising. So southern flounder are incredibly important in our North Carolina fisheries. You know, we have sort of the vision that if we could manage these fish sustainably, we could have food and sport fishing opportunities for decades to come. Unfortunately, but we don't know much about their life history offshore and their spawning migrations and where spawning occurs, and if there's possibly a cryptic offshore population that is not included in population models that are being used right now for management. And so this is some work that Fred Scharf has been doing down at UNC Wilmington with his students. Fred's involved in our project as well as a cooperator. You know, southern flounder, there's 3 species of flounder in North Carolina. They all overlap here in North Carolina. Dentatus, which is, you know, north of here. Albaguda, which is the Gulf flounder. They're very similar looking. The diagrams show you how to look at their ocelli and tell them apart. But the southern flounder, lithostigma, is the one that we're focused on. It is thought to have 2 separate subpopulations in East Coast, southeastern coast population and a Gulf Coast population based on genetic analyses. We know that the juveniles develop in estuaries, adults migrate offshore, but nobody knows exactly where. Conventional tagging suggested that in the past, you know, there's fish tagged in North Carolina have ended up as far down south as Florida, North Florida, certainly in South Carolina. And this little map from Kevin Craig's work in 2015 shows those tag returns of just standard spaghetti tags. But where are these adults spawning is the question we're after in this study. So we, you know, everybody loves flounder. They're highly sought after for commercial and recreational fishers. They're in the seafood markets. They're sold all over the East Coast and the world, in fact. And there's all kinds of economic analyses that show that they're worth up to 500 million or more in the commercial fisheries and 4 billion in recreational harvest, because everybody's trying to catch flounder. And they're consequently at the top of the commercial finfish species rankings every year in North Carolina, number 2 or 3. In the recreational fisheries, they're in the top 5 amongst all the species that you see there. So there's been a recent increase in commercial and recreational harvests that are now being curtailed by management decisions, which are extremely politically unpopular in our state. I think people are getting into bar fights over this topic. It's commercial fishermen versus recreational. Commercial fishers use trawls and gill nets and pound nets, but the recreational harvest is hook and line and gigging, and the recreational harvest have just skyrocketed recently as everybody's been buying a boat, trying to get away from COVID. By the way, I'm just recovering from COVID. I had a positive test 2 weeks ago, so this is day 13, and I actually did, even being vaccinated, got pretty sick, but I'm alive. Didn't have to go on a ventilator. So yeah, so COVID has kind of increased the harvest pressure on these things because people are trying to do stuff outdoors and buying boats and equipment. The estuaries of North Carolina are real interesting and complicated, but we have management areas as shown here on that map that the State Division of Marine Fisheries tries to manage harvests in the different zones. Albemarle, Pamlico, and then the southern region, which is Core Sound. So I guess I have a little pointer. This is Albemarle, Pamlico, and Core Sound, just so you are familiar with these terms. Harvests have been reduced to 2 weeks of harvest this year. Gear restrictions are in place. They're now banning gill nets in some areas. And so things are really heating up with management, which is why this is such an interesting species to work on. And there's been a decline. The 2019 coastwide stock assessment, which actually takes into account all the harvests across the Southeast region, not just North Carolina, but all the way down into Florida, in the South Atlantic. There has been a decline in landings, and there's been a decline in the juvenile trawl survey that was done by the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries recently. So DMF has called it overfished, overharvested, and we're seeing declines in abundance. Okay, so we got funded by the Coastal Recreational Fishing License Fund, which is money that when you buy a fishing license goes into an account and they allocate it for research. We were able to get about $500,000 to buy this telemetry equipment. And we're really interested in the first two objectives here today, determining the timing and migration pathways of fish leaving our sounds with a receiver network inshore. And then we have an array and a wave glider offshore for looking at potential spawning grounds in the ocean. Another thing I'll briefly touch on is objective 5 there, where we're looking at larval ingress at the inlets and aging larval flounder to see where they may have originated, to another way of finding the spawning area. And as this is funded by the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries, and as I say, we're working with Fred Scharf and his group at UNCW and Jeff Buckle and his group at NC State. All right, you're all familiar with this technology, but we have an inshore array. The idea was to put receivers at each of the 7 inlets shown here on the map: Oregon Inlet, Hatteras Inlet, Ocracoke, Drum Inlet, Barton's Inlet, Beaufort Inlet, and Bogue Inlet. Each inlet has 3, either a VR2 or a VR2 TX receiver. Or just like in the other study in Great South Bay, we're hanging them off of Coast Guard navigation buoys. We've got V13 and V9 tags that have both been used, 69 kilohertz Femco tags inserted into these flounder. And, there's about a 200-meter range. This is that range test software that InnovaSea Femco provides. We did a range test at Barton Inlet. The high power tags are what we're using. After a certain amount of time, about a year or so, they switch to low power. So the high power curves are the ones to focus on And we're getting about 50% detection at 200 meters range. But it probably varies with, I know it varies with tide and thermoclines and things that Mike O'Brien was talking about earlier. We have an acoustic array of 20 AR units deployed off of Cape Lookout Shoals. This is what we call an acoustic curtain. They're spaced at 1 kilometer intervals, and they're used to detect the southward and westward migrations of flounder coming through that shoal. We also are using offshore a wave glider, which is a Liquid Robotics SV2 with a VR2C receiver on it. You can see the range detection there for the array is about 500 meters, 50% range, 50% tagged detection. And we have a similar range on the wave glider. The wave glider is powered by solar energy and waves, and we can put it out as long as we want, but we're typically using 14-day or less missions. It can also measure all those other parameters you see on the screen while it's out. So here's the range test for the offshore fixed array of AR units spaced at 1 kilometer. You can see that a V9 tag about 2 meters above the seafloor was detected with 50% probability at around 500 meters. Same thing with the V13, 3 meters above the seafloor. We tried in this range test to put some at higher positions above the seafloor. We think the flounder stay on the bottom. A study by Japanese researchers showed with a couple of their Paralichthys olivaceus Japanese flounder that they do come off the bottom while migrating, but stay close to the bottom at other times. So they're kind of bouncing up and down in the water column. Tagging was done by getting fish from the commercial pound net fishery. And I'm only going to talk about the 2010 tagging study. We have 50 V9s and 60 V13s. There's the battery life about a year for the V9s, a little bit longer for the V13s. That's the main advantage. It's not so much detectability, it's how long the battery lasts. We're not talking about any of the data yet. We're still collecting the fish that were tagged last October 2021 are still out at large, and we're still looking for them, checking receivers. We don't have data to report on that. This is just Justin Mitchell's thesis, and he's looking at the size of the fish relative to their sex. And what you find is that large fish are females, and we preferentially use large fish, 425 to 645 millimeters long to put our tags into. So we're primarily tagging and following female fish here. There's also an external tag as shown here. The Division of Marine Fisheries provides us with those. They're worth $100, so we do get some tag returns from recreational harvest. Standard surgical procedures to insert the tag. We cut a hole in the coelomic cavity, insert the sterilized tag, and sew it back up using clove oil as an anesthetic. And those DMF red tags external, or as I said, are worth $100. We have gotten some of those back. I'll refer to them here in a minute. So here's some summary of the data. We've gotten about 57%, or excuse me, 51% of the tag returns, 52 overall. And the highest percentage was in Core Sound. Fish released in Core Sound. We released fish in 3 different locations: Core Sound, Pamlico Sound, and Albemarle Sound further to the north. Albemarle had the second highest detection rate, 54%, and Pamlico Sound actually had around 50%, a little lower. So first objective, determine the timing of migration. I'm going to show you some graphs of where the fish were released and then where they ended up going out the inlet. This is really interesting to the state North Carolina, one of the things they wanted to know is which inlets are most important for flounder emigration to the spawning areas offshore. This is the Albemarle Sound release site at the top of the screen here. We had an array at Mans Harbor Bridge that the DMF maintains. What you see is that one fish went out Oregon Inlet, but most fish went out Hatteras and Ocracoke Inlet, and one fish actually went into the Alligator River and then down to Drum Inlet. So there's lots of different individual routes that they took to get out into the ocean. And these are the days at large, you know, they're taking between 21 and 65 days after tagging to get out of the inlets. This is the Pamlico Sound release location and where the fish ended up going out the inlet. So some of these fish moved north to Hatteras Inlet or northeast. Some went out of Ocracoke Inlet, and 4 fish went out of so-called Evergreen Slough, which wasn't an inlet that we wanted to cover initially, but it is one that has recently opened up. The Outer Banks of North Carolina are pretty dynamic. So there's a new inlet called Evergreen Slough. Flounder are using it, and we got several fish there, 4 of them, from their external tags, not acoustic. We had no receivers at that site, but fishermen caught them and gave them to the DMF for the reward. Drum Inlet, about 3 fish there, and Barden's Inlet, 3 fish. So the Pamlico Sound fish are going out Hatteras, Ocracoke, Drum, and Barden Inlet. And then the Core Sound fish pretty much only went out Barden Inlet because the Core Sound location is close to Barden Inlet. One fish did go over to Beaufort Inlet. Others kind of went through. We have a really good array around that inlet between our study and another study. We were able to see the movement of an individual fish from the release point out through the inlet in December. And then some fish don't really leave, they stay around the inlet. We see that. So it's complicated. The migration pathway, different inlets being used farther than expected. Greatest number of fish was detected at Barden's Inlet. Hatteras and Ocracoke are especially important for the fish leaving Pamlico and Albemarle Sound. The migration is previously it's been reported by Fred Scharf that migration happens closer to October and September, but we are seeing migration out in December and even as late as January. But November seems to be the peak, when it's right between November and December. And this little diagram shows individual fish detections at different locations, showing that pattern of emigration. We might have tagged our fish a little too late in the season, but we, not without getting into too much details, we wanted it to be after the closure of the commercial season. So we waited until that happened before we tagged and released fish. So what happened offshore, and where's the potential spawning ground? The dashed line shows the wave glider path on a search path we programmed to find fish last year. And we did find fish as indicated by the little tag ID numbers. By the way, we found a whole bunch of other orphan tags that I'd be curious to know what they are. I think some of them are sharks. There's a lot of shipwrecks out there. It could be sand tiger sharks. But in any event, these are our flounder releases shown in the triangles and detections with the circles and the dot. This is just some of our offshore movements of individual fish. So one fish left Albemarle Sound, went out Hatteras Inlet and went through our array. Another fish went out Ocracoke Inlet in November and went through our array. So we're getting some real interesting patterns of migration. There are a couple of fish that were never detected at our inlets, and that's because our inlet receiver arrays aren't really a gate. there's plenty of places for fish to get through. So we don't know what inlet those guys went through, but that one fish went through our array offshore and then was detected on further south in Onslow Bay. More individual fish detections with the wave glider coming out Ocracoke Inlet and then being detected by the wave glider and then going through the array. Again, all of this is showing a southerly migration and southerly and westerly 15 to 20 miles offshore, following a depth of around 60 to 70 feet. This is an interesting one, leaving Hatteras. It was tagged in Pamlico Sound, left Hatteras Inlet and was detected way out at the edge of the shelf. Others from that release point went out Barden Inlet and went through our array. But this one that's offshore is thought to be the place we hypothesized originally where spawning would be occurring at the edge of the shelf. And so that's sort of an indication that our hypothesis is correct. More southern flounder detected offshore at the edge of the shelf. Evidence of spawning sites in January and February of 2021. This is Fred Sharf's student Collins et al. Fred and the student attached satellite pop-up tags to flounder in Pamlico and Core Sound, same release points as us. And the pop-up tags are indicating that the flounder are in Onslow Bay, near where we're observing them, but some of them are out at the edge of the shelf as well. The ones coming out of Pamlico Sound in their study, some of them are ending up way offshore further north, but I don't know if any of that is due to post-tag release current drift. Evidence of southern flounder returning. We did have one fish, or four actually fish that went out the inlet at Beaufort and went through our array, was out in February of last year around this time, further offshore, one of Jeff Buckles' receivers, and then came back in March, back into Barden Inlet. So it looks like one pattern is to leave, go out to the edge of the shelf and come back and spawn at the edge of the shelf and come back in the same year to the North Carolina estuaries.
Hey, Joe.
Yeah, is it too long?
We're about at the end of your time, so if you can wrap up in the next couple minutes, that'd be great.
Thanks, Matt. I will.
Yeah, no problem.
So just as a summary, a lot of these fish, we think some of them are remaining in the inlets, overwintering. They're migrating offshore, possibly spawning at the shelf's edge and returning in March. This is a summary of all of that. And I just wanted to mention that in 2015, we had a preliminary study. We released fish in Bogue Inlet, and it was only 25 fish, but one of them ended up further south in Winyah Bay, 323 days after release. So it's possible that these fish that we just talked about that were released in 2020 haven't yet gotten to South Carolina or are there now. So I'm looking for returns of them from the folks running the FACT arrays further south. So I'll just stop there. There's more to this, but I mean, we're doing larval fish sampling now, looking for eggs, and the connectivity model that Brian Bartlett is doing is showing that the highest probability of spawning is sort of down here in that yellow grid cell down near Wilmington. So I'm just going to acknowledge our supporters and the team again and stop there and take questions.
Okay, great. Thanks, Joe. And if you have questions, please go ahead and pop them in the chat, and we'll shift over to our last science talk of the day by, and now I'm totally blanking. I should look at the agenda first, by Greg Scomal from Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries on acoustic telemetry and public safety off of Cape Cod.
All right, I assume you guys can see me all right.
Yep, we can
Thank
see you
you.
and hear you and see your slides. Yep.
Trying to start the show. There we go. All right. Well, I don't think it's a secret to any of you folks, because most of you share data with us, that we have been tagging white sharks for quite a few years. And over the last few years, we've been doing so with acoustic tags and other technologies to enhance public safety. So that's going to be the subject of this talk, and how we're using our data and sharing those data with public safety officials, the general public, beach managers, lifeguards, so that they have a better understanding of the presence of white sharks around Cape Cod specifically. We have noticed over the last decade that white sharks are coming closer to shore to hunt seals, and that has resulted in overlap with human activities, and quite a bit of overlap. And so as a result of this overlap, we have seen a relative increase in the number of interactions between white sharks and people. Prior to recent years, our last fatal shark attack in Massachusetts was in 1936, noted in the green dot that you see here. But since then, starting in 2012, we've had interactions with swimmers, kayakers, paddleboarders, and a fatal attack on a bodyboarder in 2018. And as a result of this, and because Cape Cod is as an economy that relies very heavily on tourism and the use of their beaches, there's a lot of concern about the presence of white sharks. So we have shifted over the last few years to take a hard look at what's going on with white sharks close to shore. I think most people believe that when a white shark bites a person, they're making a mistake. And so what we're trying to do is get a sense of where, when, and how white sharks feed naturally on seals, and using a variety of technologies to observe behavior directly and indirectly to look for patterns and environmental correlates. We hope that leads to predictability and ultimately forecasting, which we think will enhance public safety. And so that's what we've been doing for the last couple of years, and using a variety of methods. Today I'll focus obviously on acoustic telemetry and our broad scale array live receivers, which Bill mentioned earlier, and then some of the fine scale array work we're doing, in addition to, I'll probably incorporate some of our pop-up satellite tag information as well. But we're also using behavioral tags, basically acceleration data loggers, as well as drones to observe behavior of white sharks close to shore. Since 2009, we have tagged over 300 white sharks using a variety of technologies. I note most of them here. Again, I'll focus today on the 287 acoustic tags that we have put out and the data we're getting from them. On the right side of the screen, you'll see where white sharks have been observed by our team along the outer Cape, in addition to some work we were doing inside Cape Cod Bay. So everything today I talk about will be focused on Cape Cod, but you'll see Cape Cod put in the context of what we're seeing relative to other parts of Massachusetts. This is what our Cape Cod array looks like. The little white circles are VR2Ws or TX receivers. The stars are live receivers, which we have deployed over major beaches, public beaches on the outer Cape, which is the eastward facing beaches along Cape Cod. And then the red boxes are the fine scale arrays that are being maintained by Brian Laguerre, the Center for Coastal Studies, and our collaborators over there and at UMass Amherst. So I'll talk about data coming from each of these, and I'm going to put it in the context of really this talk is very similar to the talks I give to the public safety officials, beach managers, the Park Service, each of the towns. Try to answer their questions relative to the presence of these animals. And of course, the first one they have is when are the sharks here? And very simply, all we need to do is plot out acoustic detections by month, and we see a very distinct seasonality. Some sharks will arrive as early as May, but June tends to be a very slow month. They ramp up in July, but the peak months are August, September, and October. What I thought was kind of interesting a few years ago before we started sharing these data or accumulating these data is because the kids go back to school, there was this general feeling that the lifeguards aren't on the beaches, so the sharks must be gone. But you could see that September and October remain big months, and the presence of these animals is really tightly correlated with water temperature, which I'll show you a little bit of shortly. Once the weather starts shifting toward late fall in November and December, the sharks really move through fairly quickly. Where do they spend their time in Cape Cod? Well, that's really simple to answer now that we've accumulated so many detections and so many sharks, is that this outer Cape, this eastward facing part of Cape Cod is where most of our sharks are detected and where they reside and where they spend the most amount of time. You'll see the eastern part of Cape Cod Bay also has relatively large numbers when you compare to some of the other parts of Massachusetts, the South Shore, all the way up to Boston and beyond. These are transient animals that you see along the South Shore. Detection numbers are extremely low and sharks are moving through as they head up into the Gulf of Maine. So if we combine where and when, we've done this for the 2019 data set, you'll see the date up in the upper left-hand corner, and then these are the actual detections of sharks as they came through in 2019. And again, you'll see the bulk of these detections in this bubble figure. These bubbles grow as the number of detections grow in those areas, but you can see again that the sharks are primarily along the outer facing beaches. So if I'm managing a beach up here on the South Shore and I look at these data, I say, well, the probability of a shark being in this area is extremely low. But if we get out to these outer Cape beaches, you can see that the presence of these animals over the course of August, September, and now we're into October is quite high, and the abundance is quite high. And those are the folks that are thinking in terms of how do we better manage our beaches to enhance public safety. And I mentioned the live receivers, and this is really with the help of Bill Woodward at the Animal Telemetry Network and Office of Naval Research in Syracuse for helping us finance and get half a dozen of these things out there. Each time one of our tagged sharks swims within the range of one of these receivers, that detection is immediately transmitted to lifeguards on this beach. This is actually the beach in Wellfleet where a young man was killed in 2018. And of course, the one thing we try to emphasize with people is, you know, as much as I'd like to say I have not tagged every white shark in the Atlantic. And as a result, what we try to do is tell the lifeguards and the beach managers, use these data to give you a sense of how often the sharks are here, how much time they spend here, and how you can use that information to better manage the beach. For example, how long do you want to close the beach to swimming when a white shark is detected? You know, and again, how long that animal stays in the area. And many of these beaches really love those data coming in, and they get a sense of the frequency with which it occurs. So that's been a big jump up for us. So we're using the broader data set to try to get a sense of forecasting the presence of these animals. And what we did in a study that was published last year is we combined the acoustic data set with our short-term pop-up satellite tag deployments. These tags were out for about a month on animals that resided in the Cape Cod area over the course of the summer. And all you see in each one of these little figures is the vertical movements of 8 different sharks. But I want you to notice the little black X's and these bars as well. These give us a sense of residency within our acoustic array. And so we modeled residency relative to water depth and location, and determined that almost 50% of the time these individual sharks are in less than 4.5 meters of water, so less than 15 feet of water. And I think that many of the general public and the beach managers were surprised by this and found it to be incredibly useful, knowing that at any given time, one of these sharks has 50% probability it's in very shallow water operating or living residing very close to where people are recreating. Another ongoing forecasting study we're doing is looking at for environmental correlates. And I mentioned this earlier, and we found that sea surface temperature is a very strong correlation with the probability of presence of these animals. And now we're combining that relationship with near real-time satellite data to come up with these probability of presence maps, which we will begin disseminating to the public on a weekly basis to give them a sense of the presence of these animals, and the probability of the presence of these animals. So here we have acoustic detections being directly translated into maps that the public can use to get a sense of when and where these animals are any given time. The harder question for us to answer is, how do they go about hunting seals? What's their methods? What's their predatory strategy and their behavior? And to do this, we're using a variety of technologies, but I'm solely going to focus now on how Brian Laguerre at the Center for Coastal Studies, who is a PhD student at UMass Amherst in Andy Danilchuk's lab, is using VPS arrays to get a sense of how these animals are using, and Mike went into this to some extent in terms of correlating behavior of these animals with habitat. And so what you see here, upper right-hand corner, are the two red boxes which indicate where these arrays are. One of them is off of Truro. It's on the left side of the screen. The other is off of Nauset Beach in Orleans. And each one of these little triangles obviously represents an acoustic receiver, and they're bunched up so close together that we can get a sense of where these sharks are. Each of these beaches is very different from a topographic point of view. So you can see the various depths color-coded on the screen here for each one of these arrays. And what's really notable about the Truro array on the left is there's a double sandbar system, which we find quite interesting, as opposed to, we don't see much of a sandbar system on Nauset Beach. And of course, these sandbars are shifting each year, which makes it really tricky to get a sense of what these animals are doing. But nonetheless, some of the data that Brian's gotten, this is just 3 weeks of detections in 2019. 31 of our tagged sharks moved through the northern Truro array. And Brian's at the stage now where he's looking at the movements of these individual animals, how it correlates with not only water depth, but also the currents, the tide, water temperature, a variety of environmental correlates. What's interesting about this particular shark that he did a great animation of is this shark staying in a deep trough between two sandbars. And what this shark is doing, we think, is waiting to ambush seals as they come off the beach to go out and forage. So again, using acoustic data to try to collect information that will help beach managers have a better understanding of the presence of these animals. You know, if I'm a lifeguard on that beach, I want to better understand what the sandbars look like, where the deep areas are, and based on this kind of information, the likelihood of a shark being in that area. We also put these resources out through the Atlantic White Shark Conservancy webpage. We have a logbook that shows all of our acoustic data going back to 2010 along Cape Cod. And you can see the changing structure of the receiver system as we went from, I think, 3 in 2010 to over 200 now in Massachusetts in 2021. We have a catalog of the sharks. Each of the sharks, we've cataloged well over 400. And there's an app called Sharktivity that we share with the public, the presence of these animals, not only acoustic detections, but satellite tag detections as well. A whole bunch of people are involved in this work, and various funding agencies, from the Atlantic White Shark Conservancy to a number of foundations. And I want to thank all of you who participate in the regional nodes and have shared data with us. We literally have detections from border to border and even beyond the border, up lots of detections in Canada because of your cooperation. So we really thank you for that. And with that, I'll answer any questions if we have time.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. And let's do one question if someone has a question for Greg.